Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain.
Hello and welcome. This is Sheila Wilson of the Wine and Cheese Program. And tonight I have a nurse that has been walking the sidewalks over at St. Vincent's Hospital. I will introduce her in just a minute, but I would like to first thank Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passionate World Talk Radio, and Jeannie White, station manager, that does our blogs and posts our shows. We've put a disclaimer on our shows, and if the show does not provide any medical advice, anything you hear or read here or on the show should always be discussed with your primary care provider. So today, I'll introduce Beckett Augat, and tell me all about your strike over at St. Vincent's Hospital.
Thanks for having me, Sheila. So I work in the emergency room there, as you well know, and we did go on strike as of March 8th at 6 a.m. We've been on strike for a little over a week now, and it is an indefinite strike. The funny thing is that actually while we're on strike, another union in the hospital, the UFCW, is on daily pickets now.
That's
because
awesome.
their negotiations have gone poorly, and they represent 600 members, a little over 600 members of the critical care techs, the PCAs, the secretaries, the housekeeping, OR staff, and I believe cafeteria, but I'm not positive on that one. But it's the food workers. So so they've had that. They were doing their daily pickets now, and informational daily pickets. So they have Tenet Hospital at St. Vincent Hospital. Tenet Healthcare has two unions on strike, or one on strike, one on picket in the same hospital because the conditions are so poor. The UFCW is in agreement with the M&A that the staffing ratios need to be taken care of. As I said, I work in the emergency room. For years, it was standard to kind of have 5 patients. We do have the ICU law where it's 2 to 1, and in our contract, it can be 1 to 1 per the law, depending upon the nurse if that patient's sick enough. In our contract, they're supposed to treat an ICU patient like an ICU patient, regardless of where they are in the hospital, and they've never followed that in the emergency room. So you can have an ICU patient, and you can have another patient if you're in the trauma rooms with a hallway patient, and maybe another hallway patient. You could have 2 ICU patients that are unstable and be running room to room. It's just, and you could be in room 7 and have the ICU patient there and also have 4 other patients, even up to 5, because our director started saying, well, there's no ratio in your contract, so you can take 6 to 1.
Has she ever been an ER nurse?
She has not.
She has not, so she has no idea.
No. So she has not worked in the emergency room. She said she would put on scrubs and try every position, but we have yet to see that happen. So the ratio, like the ENA, the Emergency Nurses Association, recommends a 1 to 4, dependent upon the acuity of the patient. And it wasn't the ENA, but I believe it was the National Nurses Union came out with a 1 to 3 ratio, where we put in for a 1 to 4. And they won't even acknowledge or discuss the emergency room staffing at all. We've cut down in areas. We've tried, we've redrawn our proposals, and they refuse to even acknowledge it. They've made one position. We wanted a stat RN for the floors to respond to rapid responses so that the ICU resource nurse doesn't have to leave the ICU. And we wanted 3 critical care nurses so that if there's an ICU boarder in the ER or an ICU boarder in the PACU, that they would be able to cover there so that those nurses aren't staying and that ER nurse doesn't have an ICU patient plus 4 other patients, 5 other patients.
Well, that certainly makes a lot of sense.
And a lot of hospitals do that. Well, they offered to give us 1 critical care nurse 24/7, which means that if a certain nurse calls out in the ICU, that's where they go, and everybody else, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't eliminate that ICU nurse, resource nurse, from having to leave her ICU anytime there's a rapid. somewhere else in the hospital. So they, we came back in the last negotiation session that we had well over a week ago, and they said our last proposal stands as is. So their last proposal was very divisive. They're trying to kind of segregate out groups of nurses, and in the year of the nurse and during the pandemic, they wanted to do a retro pay raise of 1% for half the year of 2020, year of COVID. They wanted to do a 2% bonus on all hours paid out during that, except for per diem. So Tenet Hospital, during the pandemic, actually furloughed a large group of nurses, especially ones that had insurance, and the per diems really helped to carry us through this pandemic, covering shifts, picking up, loading throughout the hospital. They were really amazing. But because of the increased amount of hours they worked, they wanted to eliminate them from getting that 2% bonus, which is it's unfair. It's shady. And the per diems are part of our union. They do pay. They are M&A union, part of our bargaining unit. They deserve that bonus too. They worked hard.
Did they give a reason why they wouldn't include the per diems?
No. Nope. So then they also go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, what I just wanted to say is that, but your main thing for striking is for patient safety, and that's what you were talking about.
Not just there's also another reason, and there's also a couple other reasons, but patient safety is a huge one. They figured out how to maximize, 5 patients to a nurse on the floor during the second surge. They were giving 5 COVID patients to a nurse, and these are patients that you can't see, that are in rooms that you have to don and doff to go in and out. And it was just really unsafe. And these nurses were working their tails off. They weren't taking breaks. They were dying. You're in and out of that garb, and you're just sweating. And it's so hot. And now you're not taking a break, and you're just constantly running, trying to make sure that a patient doesn't fall. I would love Tenet to actually come to be truthful and discuss the amount of falls, because before COVID, we used to have fall huddles every day. They would have huddles about the amount of falls in the hospital. It was a big, big deal. And now you can't even get a one-to-one anywhere in the hospital except for the ER for our suicidal, patients and our behavioral health unit area. But the rest of the hospital, they'll pull their PCAs to sit down there. They'll pull their PCAs to go to other floors, but they're not staffing these one-to-ones. And part of the ER staffing guidelines was actually that we have 10 patient observers 24/7, 3 of which would go to the behavioral health unit in the emergency room, which would leave 7 for the rest of the hospital, so that we could stop pulling our PCAs. And that was part of the problem with the UFCW, and why they're having issues with their negotiations also is because they are pulling these PCAs off the floor. They're not doing the job they're hired to do, and they're leaving the other PCAs to have 9 to 12 patients each.
Now, can you say what a PCA is?
A personal care assistant.
Okay. So that's like a medical assistant?
The CNAs on the floor, the certified nurses assistants.
Okay.
They're the ones who will help get vitals, they'll help bathe, they'll help toilet, they'll help feed. They're the right hands for us nurses. They're the ones, that are keeping an eye when we're getting meds. They're a necessity. And they're treating them like an afterthought. And their economic wages are so poor, I'm surprised that we retain any of them. They really deserve a lot more for all that they do and all that they do for the patients. And especially in the year of COVID where, we haven't had visitors in there. We don't have people. These are the ones that are in there 24/7 with your family, treating them, feeding them, caring for them, making sure that they're turned, making sure that they're bathed and washed and their teeth are brushed, just the basic necessities to make a human feel human. And Tenet doesn't seem to understand this. They just think that, They only see dollar signs. They don't see humans. And that's part of the problem.
Right, right. That's throughout the whole healthcare system, I believe.
Which is heartbreaking.
It is, because unless it's maybe their family member, and they will go to the hospital of their choice, and they will seek out somebody that they know and ask them to take care of them.
They'll call the directors ahead of time and say, my family member's on the way in. This is a VIP.
Yeah. So stop
and
what you're doing.
And then they'll have them call the resource and put a room aside. Oh, yeah. But, they just treat everybody else like a number.
Right. And that's all you are. It's a number with the dollar sign.
Yeah. And another reason for the nurses going on strike is that during in our contract now for our floating language, we actually have a floating language called Helping Hands. So if, like during the surge, when they wanted to float or we didn't have enough to do in the ER, I offered to float up to the ICU. By no means am I an ICU nurse. I'm trained in the ER. I can help to set up and stabilize an ICU patient and get them up to the ICU, but to do the continuous care and monitoring and everything that they do, I'm not trained for that.
Right.
I'm a critical care nurse, but it's different specialties. It'd be like having, your podiatrist do your cardiac surgery. It's not the same.
Right.
We have our specialties. So they wanted to, during the first surge, just float anybody up to the ICU from anywhere in the hospital with a 5-hour class. And because our contract language is so strong, and
wait a minute, Becca,
yep.
Repeat what you said. They wanted to float you folks after you had a 5-hour class?
Any nurse in the hospital to the ICU after having a 5-hour class, a 1-day class. Yeah, that's what they wanted to do. And we fought it because our contract is strong and has the contract language that if we are to float to another area that is outside of our specialty, that we will go there as helping hands, which I did. During the first surge, I went up to the ICU and, if I was pretty much the handmaiden. If the nurse needed something that was in the room, I would go and get it. I would help and go in and be part of a turn team in the COVID patient rooms. But I was under another nurse in there because I don't have access to their computer system. I don't have access to their med rooms. I don't have access, and I'm not an ICU nurse. So I would just be at their beck and call to help them with whatever they could do, whatever nursing 101, the basics of nursing, I would go in there and help them with that. I would help with bathing, brushing teeth. We had a confused gentleman. I just sat there and talked to him for a bit so that they could not be focused on him and go focus on somebody who was a little bit more sick. Just different things like that. And they want that out of our contract. So they've tried to change our floating language so that they could get that out of the contract because they truly believe that a nurse is a nurse is a nurse. These are the individuals that try to fit a circular peg into a square hole, a circular peg into a square hole. So they don't understand. They don't understand because they're not nurses. They're not bedside. They're not medical. They're, business. And, our CEO is an engineer. I'm not quite sure how that got into being the top of, our CEO of healthcare.
Wow.
But I can tell you that she's not a mathematician because she keeps trying to say that there's a 36% increase, and she's trying to include steps and percentages and add them all up over time for a 5-year contract, which is what they're also trying to get, which with how the staffing is right now, we are not going to subject our patients to unsafe ratios for 5 years. That's just not going to happen. Because if the patients aren't safe, it puts nurses' license on the line having that many patients that you can't keep track of. But, a license, I can always get a different job. I can always, fight to get my license. But if I lose a patient because I have too many patients and there's just not enough of me going around, there is nothing that is going to take that off my soul or my conscience.
Right,
because
it could have been avoided.
I will carry that for the rest of my life. And not a single one of our managers, nor will the CEO who doesn't have a nursing license, hand over their license and put it on them because they didn't staff us appropriately.
Right.
So we're out there fighting for safe patient staffing, safe patient ratios, and just we want our patients to be well cared for. I mean, we didn't go into nursing for a paycheck. I mean, because, I live paycheck to paycheck still, and we go into it because we enjoy taking care of people, and we want to help you heal, and we want to be there for you at the worst time. As an emergency room nurse, that's one of my blessings. Is when I recently just actually had one of my committee members. I had done a Twitter post for the M&A as to why we were on strike, and her niece had sent her a picture of me with the message of that she was my nurse in the ER and on like one of my worst nights, and she sat on the bed with me and was teary-eyed, and I remember her. She was so great. And she didn't know that her aunt knew me. And her aunt didn't know that I had taken care of her. But she just wanted to make her aunt aware that, that she stood with the nurses, and I was one of the reasons why, never mind just her aunt. And it's those moments that, you're touching another person, you're helping them, you're getting them on, the right road to recovery or healing, or just, it's such a huge responsibility, but at the same time, it's such a huge gift to be able to touch people's lives and be able to have an effect on them, that it's a calling. And, we want to be bedside right now. We don't like being on the street. We want to be with our patients. We miss our patients, but we also want our patients to be safe. And if nobody's going to advocate for them, one of our roles as a nurse is to be a patient advocate, and that is what we are doing by striking right now.
That's exactly right. And the only way to get health care back is for the nurses to do it, because all of these other folks that are in there. And just by listening to you, I'm still kind of bowled over with the 5-hour class. And then I worked in CCU for 10 years. And now the coronary care unit is not a simple, it's very complex. People come in with a lot of different problems, and you really have to be keyed into it. Otherwise,
the acuity has changed so much even in the last 5 years. Even in the last year, they've added drips to the floor like cardizem and nifedipine and insulin that they didn't have on the floors before. But because of COVID, they changed how it was, and now these nurses are watching these drips, and those are pretty intense drips. You've got to be careful.
Yeah,
you've got to be monitoring them and watching everything. And, if you've got 5 patients, and now mind you, 5 patients are in 3 different rooms, that you can't see them unless you're in the doorway.
Yep.
So it's not like, it's not like it's a little cubby where you can see all 5 patients in one big room either. It's just going to lead to something really bad happening, and we just don't want that to happen. And we're already seeing it with the amount of falls that have been going on, because they're not providing the staff. They're not providing the one-to-ones, the patient observers. They're not having enough PCAs on the floor. There's no way a PCA should have 9, 10, 11, 12 patients with 2 nurses. There's no way.
No, that's dangerous.
3 people for 12 that's just dangerous. This is where errors occur, because now you're rushing because you're trying to do everything for everybody, because as nurses, it's the heart to care, and we want to treat each of our patients like it was our mother, brother, sister, father. You treat them like their family, because you wouldn't want your family treated any other way but that way.
Right.
So you're trying to do your best care. You're trying to do your best care in a shorter amount of time, and it's just not possible. And then you leave your shift downtrodden, disgusted with yourself because you don't feel like you did everything that you should have or could have, but you're doing everything you can within the amount of time allotted and the amount of staff provided. And it leaves you just feeling unwhole. It makes you, frustrated, angry, depressed, anxious that you forgot something. So add to the pandemic, but then add being short-staffed to that. And it's just affecting these nurses and affecting me. It's the worst possible scenario is that we've had this pandemic, and even before the pandemic, we were talking staffing. We had a meeting prior to the pandemic starting where 200 of 800 nurses showed up to speak as to the untenable conditions of the hospital and the different units and why the staffing ratios weren't doable. And the hospital still turned a deaf ear. They're not listening to their nursing staff on the floor, the ones who are at the bedside.
Now, Becca, you've been talking about taking care of the patients and trying to do your best there. But I don't hear what you're saying about now. The other thing that you have to do is your charting. That takes a long time, and it takes away from the patient. So how do you squeeze that in when you have a patient that, like in the ER, you have one, maybe possibly two ICU patients. Then you have maybe this patient that is intoxicated, loud and boisterous and doing his thing or her thing. Then you have maybe a mental health patient, or you might have abdominal pain, maybe somebody that is having some chest pain, but it could be more GI problems, stuff like this. How can you possibly stop and think and chart correctly with all of this going on?
You end up going back and back charting, unfortunately. There's no time to chart right in that moment. You might put a little note to remind you to go back and back chart later, or you have that piece of tape on your leg that you write something down, or you write the vitals down and you go back and you have to back chart. And
so you use your uniform?
You'll take a little piece of tape and put it on you, yeah. People write on their arms, or some people have little notebooks. Everybody has their own different system. You're right.
Hands, arms, the whole bit. Yeah, I understand. It's my experience in the CCU. It was wonderful, and we didn't seem to have too much of a problem because it was a full staff. But when we were shot, we knew that was dangerous. And the harder we tried to get help, now I'm talking years ago. I'm not talking yesterday, last year, 3 years ago. But it always seemed either the supervisor would come down, but not all supervisors have the education. Like I told you that we went out on strike, and the people that manned the ER were supervisors, some of the administrators, and they hadn't been in nursing for years. They knew their stuff at one point, and they were helping out. But that's the type of people that are taking care of them. And I'm not saying anything bad about them, but it's just like now in your ER, there's a lot of people, they don't even know where the utility room is. Is that correct?
Well, they do have some that have crossed. So there was actually a significant amount of ER nurses that crossed because they don't understand. Unfortunately, the ER is a special department. And I think that we are so used to making do with whatever comes through the doors because that's just how we're trained, that we don't understand that it's not acceptable and that we can stand up to that and advocate for our patients for better ratios, better numbers. It's always that question of, well, how do you have ratios in the ER? How about you staff appropriately? And then if it is a slow night, you can flex people home because unfortunately, St. Vincent's is one of the few hospitals that actually has flex staffing. So a 24 flex nurse, a nurse can be hired as a 24 flex, and they can be flexed up to 32 hours every week, and they can only refuse to flex down once. They can actually be flexed down below their shift once a month also. So this hospital has a lot of flexibility in the nursing schedule.
Yeah, that sounds weird.
They take full advantage of it. They have, during this whole situation, flexed nurses up They haven't been hiring enough staff. When you do have like a full-time position, a 36 or a 32 straight, that somebody leaves, a lot of times they turn that into another flex position. And that is actually part of another reason why we're out, is because, as I was saying, they're trying to alienate groups of nurses. First, it was the per diem nurses that they were alienated with, not giving them the 2% bonus for the year of COVID. But then also the 24 nurses. So at a hospital that is close to us, if you work 20 hours or more, you get 80/20 on your health insurance, and they have better health insurance than we do. You know, they go to the emergency room and they pay a standard, you know, specialist copay of like $25, $35. Whereas if I go to my own hospital, my own emergency room, with the insurance that they provide, and I have the top tier health insurance, I pay a lot of money for it every 2 weeks. I have to actually pay a $150 co-payment to go be seen in my own ER. And
wow.
That and I have the 80/20. So anybody that's not full-time, and they consider that 32 hours or above, they have to pay $65.35. So most of their paycheck goes to paying their insurance premiums. So here's the fun part. Those 24 flex positions, they flex them up to 32. Those 24-hour positions, you know, will pick up an extra shift and go up to 32, which is considered full-time, and they should have full-time benefits, but they don't get them. So one of our proposals was that anybody 24 hours and above gets 80/20. Well, the hospital came back and said, well, only the 24 flex will get it, not the 24 straight, even though the 24 straight can pick up hours. So again, we're trying to alienate out a group of nurses and cause some division, and it's just the games that Tenet pays. You know, right now they're paying millions to save pennies. They've paid almost, so for the first round of replacement nurses, and they can't replace us. This is our home. You know, they're from out of state. They don't know where everything is or how everything works or all the policies or procedures. We've heard that there's been a lot of incidences that have occurred in there. And these replacement nurses, so they had to put down $1.7 million to hold the position, and then they put down the Friday before the strike another 3.7. So just initially it was $5.4 million for replacement nurses, and that's just only for the first couple weeks. So now also they're having police details at all the entrances, which we've figured out has cost them anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 a day. And they hired a secondary security agency. We had problems. They had hired, G4S to come in and be security with our SPOs. We don't have enough SPOs. They couldn't get enough extra security with G4S, so they went to another security agency. And they were hiring 20 security officers a day to watch the garage in different areas. So
now
I don't know what they're paying them, but no, we didn't have enough security on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
Never mind this uptick.
So what are they for? I mean, it's nice if they have security.
To watch what? To watch over the cars.
To watch over the cars.
Yeah. To make sure that
so these are different cars than when you worked there.
No,
these cars do something.
These are just the cars of the nurses that cross the picket line.
Oh, in case you guys assault them or something.
Yeah, well, I don't
flatten their tires.
We're nurses. Yeah, we're nurses. We're not going to go in and do that.
No.
They might yell, and you know what? It is crappy. It is crappy when your coworkers cross the line because you're out there fighting. You're losing your paycheck. You're putting, I have a son. I have a mortgage. I have the same bills as anybody else. So Don't tell me it's because of your bills that you're okay putting patients at risk. Don't tell me that, you want to be bedside for the patient. Well, you're the same people who tell me how unsafe it is, and then you want to be there still while it's still unsafe. We waited till, Carolyn Jackson, the CEO, has a nasty little habit of saying how disappointed and irresponsible we are because it was a pandemic. Well, this could have happened during the pandemic. The strike could have happened a long time ago. We haven't had a contract since 2019. It's now 2021.
Yep.
We've tried bargaining in good faith. And what we did was we waited until the surge has gone down. There aren't as many COVID patients in there. We waited. We did the responsible thing. We kept going to the negotiation table. We kept making, changes to our proposals and trying to negotiate with them. They have done the irresponsible thing. They have forced us to this. They refused to negotiate, and they've refused to come back to the table. That's irresponsible. That's disappointing. And it's all on Carolyn Jackson. She has a choice, and she's making the wrong choices right now. She would rather put nurses from other states in the hospital and at the bedside of our patients than to negotiate in good faith with her nurses. And it's hurtful for the nurses that we worked with that crossed, because after we do all this and we risk everything and we're struggling and we're out there in the cold and they're inside still earning a paycheck and getting their backs patted by the management, they're still going to have the same contract that we have. They'll still be protected by the union. They're getting all that, and they're not paying dues right now, just like we are. The M&A waives dues while you're on strike for all members, including the ones who cross the picket line. So they'll still reap all the benefits that we have fought for. But at the same time, I constantly remind myself it's not for them, it's not for me. And even, talking to some of the groups and the unit, like we had almost all of same-day surgery, all of GI, they all are on the picket line, on the strike line with us. And it doesn't affect them. They already have ratios. The OR is all out with us. You know what? It doesn't affect them. They're 1-to-1. It doesn't affect them at all. But what, I constantly remind myself and I remind others is that we're not doing it for our individual areas and our bubbles. It's not, it might not affect us personally in our departments, but collectively it affects our patients. And right. My patient in the ER will be the patient in the GI lab tomorrow, which will be the patient on the med surg or the cardiac floor the next day. So my patient is their patient, is somebody else's patient, is all in the hospital. So we're there and we're out there advocating for our patients.
That is awesome. That really is. However, I don't think that the public understands as much, and I hope with this wine and cheese program and where it's going to be delivered to, that people will truly understand that you have more interest in the patients than you do anything else, and all you want is safety for the patients. I totally understand it. It's just people need to know what it's like to be in any unit. If you're in the medical unit, you have 24 patients and you have 2 nurses and 2 aides, or you call them PCAs.
Yeah.
That's not even enough, especially when it's dinner time and you're trying to feed these.
5 or 6 to 1 on some of the floors. And they'll put up a red ticker saying that, there's trouble in the ER, we're backing up, and they'll push them to go over numbers. So they're not even respecting the contract that we already have in place.
Yeah.
They don't respect it. And then, during the furlough and during the pandemic, they also went on a hiring freeze. So all these nurses who got out of nursing school and were working already as PCAs or critical care techs in our hospital couldn't get jobs in our hospital because they wouldn't hire anybody. And it takes time to train a nurse. So, these are the issues that they don't talk to nurses. They don't understand what we do. They don't understand what it's like to be at the bedside. They don't understand what it's like to unfortunately, it's changed this year. Nursing has changed so drastically that, you're doing Zoom calls with family members. The ICU nurses telling me about how they're standing in the corner just crying into their mask because they know that they're saying goodbye.
Yep.
And you're standing there with them, and that's the only contact that they had to the outside world. They don't understand that. They don't understand, even before COVID, just sitting there and holding a dying patient's hand and wiping their foreheads and just trying to make them as comfortable as possible. And explaining to the family who might be at the bedside with them what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, what you'll do and the different steps, and just taking the time and having that time to be there for that patient and that family. And they'll just never understand, because they're not nurses, how important that is, and how important it is not only to the patients, because they're human. It's not they're not some cog, but also how important it is to the nurses to be able to have that time and to be able to use that nursing heart. And they'll never understand that. Right,
because the only time they'll ever understand it is when they're hospitalized and they don't have a nurse there because she's too busy with 5 other patients. Yeah. But then because they're higher ups, they do their private nursing and all that, so they're catered to. But, it's kind of culturally, I guess. Well, I certainly wish you luck. I've been on, as I said earlier, I've been on the strike team, and it was cold. I can remember being cold. And the nurses, and life continuously goes on. I mean, we had one of our nurses that was a great marcher, and all of a sudden her child needs surgery, and it was like, oh, my God, now he needs surgery? Can't he wait?
While your insurance is out, and
Yeah, no, it's just absolutely incredible. Well, is there anything else that you would like to say before we close?
So, anybody who wants to come down, support the nurses, you can stand with us. You can, walk with us with a sign. Even if you go by and just honk your horn. They do have a strike relief fund, and they have a Venmo site on the M&A site. Just offering words of encouragement to any of the nurses that that are out there on the strike line. It's hard. It's not easy. It's, there's a lot of sacrifice being made on every single nurse's part that's out there striking right now. And there's some days where it's just, we're only 7 days in, and it's just rough. And the last time they did this was 21 years ago, and it was a 49-day strike. I'm hoping we don't end up that far out. I really hope that comes to its senses. But another thing that you can do is call the hospital and put pressure on them, saying that tell them as a community that you want them to come back to the table and negotiate with the nurses and with the UFCW fairly. Come to the table in good faith and negotiate. Don't tell us that this is what it is and you'll just have to accept it. That's not negotiation. That's dictatorship.
No. That's right. Well, until next time, Beckett, we shall say goodbye, and I will end this program. Again, I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, CEO, and Jeannie White, Station Manager, for having us on and listening to our shows. So I'll say good night, and thank you.
Thank you for listening to Passionate World Talk Radio. You can listen to this program all over again by going over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. You can also hear it on Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon Alexa, AMFM247.com every Tuesday evening between 8 and 9 p.m. YouTube, Facebook Live, LinkedIn, and all the other podcast directories one can find on the Internet.